The premiere of season 11 of Doctor Who was probably the most anticipated season premiere of the show since the series premiere, and it was anticipated for mostly the wrong reasons due to casting changes rather than creative changes. For me, the Doctor's gender is really no issue at all. Summing up what I said last time, what we've got in critics of this change are people who watch a show about an alien with an infinite number of faces who looks perfectly human, traveling through time in an old English police box that's larger inside than out, and they're perfectly okay with all of this as long as that alien is played by a man. But the moment a woman is cast in the role, suddenly this concept becomes too ridiculous for them to believe. I really don't think that people who are taking that position are worth wasting any time on. The Doctor's being played by a woman, so be it. And for the most part, the issue of the Doctor's gender very rarely came up at all. If I recall correctly, the Witchfinders was the only episode where it played any role whatsoever. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. First, there are spoilers to follow, so if you haven't seen all of season 11, you may not want to watch any further because I am going to end up giving things away here, so fair warning. So, season 11 in general, overall, it was okay. It was good, but it wasn't great like the last few seasons. But the problems with this season had nothing to do with casting or the more openly political stories that they told. If anything, they had more to do with structure, both of individual stories and of the season as a whole. So let's start with some good. I like the fact that the season didn't have any huge plot arcs that made it hard to understand what was going on if you weren't watching the show religiously. And I like the decision not to have any past characters or regulars show up. The creators of the show very publicly committed to a clean jumping on point where new viewers wouldn't have to be conversant in the massive amount of backstory that Doctor Who has in order to understand the show. And then they followed through on that. It was a commitment to accessibility that was a very good choice, and I think it was handled very well. They also broke with a general tradition of the revival and had no overarching theme. Even back to Eccleston's season, there have generally been some theme running through the season, generally not to any overwhelming degree, but it was definitely there. Bad Wolf, Torchwood, the Hybrid, the Crack in the Wall, and so on. In fact, pretty much the only running theme this season was Graham and Ryan slowly coming to deal with Grace's death in the season premiere and the associated issues of what constitutes a family. If you saw my previous Doctor Who review, I explained how Moffat's stories have almost uniformly been defined by escaping death, cheating death, reversing death, surviving death, overcoming death, defeating death, outliving death, and just finding loopholes and ways around death in general, which is why I found this season's story of slow acceptance to be so refreshing. It's a far more realistic approach, and it's far more difficult to portray properly, but they really nailed it, especially with Grace being mourned by two people who haven't accepted each other yet, mostly due to Ryan's issues with Graham and with his own father. In standard Doctor Who fashion, they do meet Grace again, sort of, and they confront the concept of loss and acceptance of loss head on. But it didn't come out of the blue. It was something that developed through the entire season, and it was developed very well and at a reasonable pace, and it paid off at the end. And I was very happy with that. I also had no issue with the more overtly political overtones of the season because, let's be honest, people who argue that Doctor Who isn't political are not paying the slightest bit of attention. Think about it. The Ood, whose world became home to a corporation that partially lobotomized the native population and sold them off as slaves. The Empress of Mars, which takes the typical protecting of people against an invading force storyline and turns it upside down by having the invading force be humans, specifically British soldiers in 1881, arguably near a high point in England's efforts to command and control the entire world. The Zygon two-parter, where hapless and innocent Zygons who live peacefully among us and want to go about living their lives in peace are going to be exposed and vilified as foreign invaders in order to precipitate a war that somebody else wants. Even all the way back to season 1, there was a Slitheen, and even back in episode 2, there was Cassandra, both of whom were perfectly willing to commit mass murder, even genocide, just to turn a profit. All of these things are political. The only difference with season 11 is that they made little or no effort to paste over the proper nouns with alien names before they told their stories. They simply dumped the characters into the actual moment in history and let the politics represent themselves. And on that point, I was struck when I was watching the episode Demons of the Punjab, pretty much Yaz's only chance to shine this season. that I was watching an episode that could never and would never have aired when the show first began in the 1960s. A story that's openly critical of England's actions less than 20 years after the event occurred, when people who caused it were still in power. A story like that would never have gotten past the network censors and been approved to air in the 1960s. It never would have happened. And this is a form of progress, being able to look back on your past and be critical of it. Unlike here in America, where people are still arguing that the Confederate flag doesn't represent racism in any way, shape, or form. On a lesser note, however, despite having a lot of good pieces, this season never quite comes together in the way the previous years did. The season's structural problems are very similar to individual episode structural problems. Mainly, things don't build properly. Story structure traditionally has 5 steps: exposition to set everything up, the rising action as the story develops, the climax as everything comes to a head, the falling action, and then resolution or denouement. Episodes this season, I don't want to say they botched it up, but it wasn't done in a typical fashion. The exposition often gets dropped in whenever the writer decides it's time for the story to advance, and many episodes don't seem to have a proper climax. The antagonists of the episode don't see their stories resolved so much as simply disappear. Often literally. In the season premiere, Zim-Shah is tricked into using the DNA bombs that he didn't realize were placed back on himself, and the doctor throws his recall device at him, and he disappears. Okay, fine. Next episode, The Ghost Monument. The race's organizer and 2 remaining contestants are built up and become fairly interesting characters, and then they literally disappear from the proceedings without a word of explanation as to what happens to them after that. Their story doesn't really resolve, it just disappears. Next episode, Rosa. The antagonist is Krasko, whose time device is used against him to send him to somewhere in the past, and that's the last we hear of him. He simply disappears too. The Saranga conundrum. They don't resolve the issue with the Pting so much as blast it into space and forget about it. And so on. These are major characters in their stories, and they get swept aside and forgotten with minimal resolution, and that's a big problem. On a show like this, problems need to be resolved, not simply disappeared or poofed out of existence. Kerblam was one of my favorite episodes of the season, and yes, it was political. They pasted the word Kerblam over the word Amazon, and it wasn't too subtle. Amazon actually does have multiple patents on a wristband that will show exact movement of the wrist and how much employees are working at any given second, raising all sorts of security and privacy concerns. If you take 30 seconds just to stand there instead of packing boxes, they would know it. And if you don't find that creepy and scary, you should. I don't know that they've rolled it out yet, but they do have the patents on it, and they can at any time. But we live in a world where, as much as we fear our jobs metaphorically being taken by the Ood, or other people who don't look like us, we're much more likely to lose our jobs to automation, which is why it's a very peculiar choice in the middle of this commentary to make a person the villain and to make the AI that runs the automation into the good guy trying to prevent the tragedy. It's a good twist for the story, but I'm not sure it's a good idea to undercut the episode's message that severely. But for my money, the best that this season had to offer was the episode It Takes You Away. Now, there was some wasted time. Ribbons, the character in the anti-zone between universes, was rather superfluous, and that whole plotline took time away from much more interesting things. And frankly, Eric is a shit parent for setting up a system to terrify his blind daughter into staying put and then running off for his own benefit. But beyond that, I love this episode. The Salatrac was a benign entity, not a monster or a parasite. It just wanted to spend time with others instead of being alone, and it wanted to experience new things and to understand and to learn. It was, essentially, the Doctor. The appearance as a frog with a simple "because it delights me" as an explanation may have turned some people off, but the innocence of that really sold the moment for me. This was a powerful character story about grief and loss, which worked on its own, but also paid off Ryan and Graham's stories for the season, with a solid explanation being built in for why the Salatrac had to leave at the end instead of simply disappearing it, as so many other things did this year. We really did need more of this. And instead, we got the season finale. Now, to anyone who watched this season, do you remember the title of the season finale? Last year was The Doctor Falls, and the season before that was Hellbent. And those were very powerful episodes that paid off long seasons. But do you remember what this season finale's title was? Well, firstly, I had to look it up. The Battle of Ranskor av Kolos was all of this season's bad habits brought back and displayed quite proudly. It brought back Zim Shaw with a plan for revenge, and he didn't come off as too much of a threat considering he was previously established to be basically a cheater who needed technological assist to accomplish his goals, even when he wasn't supposed to use them, so it's not a huge payoff to have him here. It does give Graham a chance to confront him again and wrap up that storyline. The Doctor telling Graham that, if you do this and follow through on revenge, you can't travel with me anymore, followed by Graham stating point blank that he accepts that but isn't going to back down. That was a really good scene, and you very rarely have the Doctor and companions interacting quite that strongly or quite that much in conflict with each other. So I did enjoy that, but the actual confrontation where Graham chose not to kill Zimja, it was just kind of there. It didn't carry the weight that a scene like that potentially have been building for the entire year should have carried. And this episode also had the worst of the plot stalls this season, because a lot of the episodes of the season involved blundering around until the Doctor abruptly goes, "Oh, I remember now, I'm so stupid. What we're dealing with is whatever." This episode also added an amnesia element, which gets shaken off eventually, but it allows the characters to go around for a while until the plot decides it's time for them to remember and take the actions that they would have right from the start if they weren't prevented from doing so by a plot contrivance. And that is lazy writing at its worst. Instead of structuring the story so it generates naturally, they put a roadblock in the way and then lift it when it's convenient. And that is just awful writing. And while I remember the Doctor Falls and Hellbent very clearly as episodes and what led up to them and what happened to them, I remember almost nothing about the Battle of Someplace We've Never Heard Before. I had to read the plot summary to remember what this episode was even about. It is that forgettable. So, looking at the season, they did 10 episodes, and 5 were written by the new showrunner, Chris Chibnall, and he also co-wrote another. And the episodes that had the most impact on me, the ones that were the most memorable, were the ones that other people wrote. Chibnall co-wrote Rosa, which was a good episode, and I appreciate in that episode that the Doctor and companions became a part of events without being their cause, even if the ending payoff of Rosa changed the world, see they named an asteroid after her, fell incredibly flat. Others wrote Demons of the Punjab, which was a vicious critique on colonialism, Kerblam, which was about automation supplanting people and exploiting workers for profit, The Witchfinders, which did involve fear of the unknown and finding easy scapegoats to blame rather than trying to understand and resolve actual problems, and It Takes You Away, which dealt with grief and loss and how avoiding dealing with it ultimately hurts everyone involved. And those are episodes that stuck with me much more than the others, with the admitted exception of the first 2 episodes, which established the new crew and status quo. And look, I understand every beginning is rough. When a new creative crew comes in, it takes some time to get their feet under them. Eccleston's season has clear signs of being the first season of a show, with aspects that were cleaned up in the seasons that followed. And Moffat, for all the grief that he gets, is actually a very good writer, and while he did make some mistakes, especially in prioritizing plot over character in the Smith era, he sorted that out in the Capaldi era, and while he still wasn't a perfect writer, he did give us the best season of the revival in year 9, Capaldi's middle season. So I want to believe that the rough spots of season 11 with the new crew will be smoothed out with experience. But the fact that the episodes that had the least problems and were the most memorable were the episodes that the showrunner didn't write is a big red flag. Now, I'm not trying to feel discouraged. The season went in new directions, explored new grounds, and had some good pieces, even some great pieces, even if they didn't all come together properly in the end. All of which is good, because, like its title character, the show will continue to change and evolve over time. And I hope that with the season under their belts, Chibnall and his creative staff can keep what worked and improve on what didn't, and follow up what was overall an average season with one that is far better and far more memorable. Because this season is just kind of there. And the bar for this show is higher than that. I hope they can reach it again soon.